The final curtain call, the velvet curtain, heavy with decades of dust and expectation, trembled slightly. Backstage, the air crackled with a peculiar blend of anticipation and finality. Dean, his face a roadmap of etched lines and fading charm, walked with a deliberate slowness towards the gleaming grand piano. Frank, sharp-suited and radiating a brittle confidence, watched him, a faint question mark hovering in his eyes. The sold-out crowd at the Sands held its breath, ready for the legendary banter, the familiar tunes. But then Dean's fingers, gnarled and surprisingly nimble, touched the keys. A melody, hauntingly familiar, yet utterly out of place, filled the hushed theatre. It was a simple, tender tune, a waltz of fragile hope. Recognition flickered across Frank's face, then dissolved into raw, gut-wrenching understanding. This wasn't a standard, not a crowd-pleaser. This was their song, the one Dino Jr. had penned for Frank's 50th, a forgotten melody from a brighter time. The bet, a casual boast from a boozy night in 62. I bet you $1 million I can make you cry in front of D's 000 people, and you won't even be mad at me. Frank had laughed it off, long since relegated it to the forgotten archives of their shared history. But Dean hadn't forgotten, not when the earth swallowed his son whole. Tears, hot and unstoppable. He tried to compose himself, to maintain the impermeable facade, but the music, a cruel echo of joy, rendered him utterly defenseless. He was crying, truly crying, on stage, before every single soul in the packed auditorium. He understood. This wasn't about a bet anymore. This was Dean's final, devastating communication, a weaponized memory hurled from the depths of his own bottomless grief. The sound of Dean's playing, a lament for a life unlived, filled the space between them. Dean had won, but the victory tasted of ash. The familiar scent of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne hung heavy in the air backstage, a phantom limb of 1,000 forgotten nights. Dean, his face a roadmap of hard living, ignored it all. His gaze, clouded with a profound weariness, settled on the polished black of the grand piano. He hadn't touched those keys in years, not like this. Tonight, however, was different. This wasn't about entertainment. It was about an overdue reckoning. Frank, oblivious, was still basking in the final applause of their set, a practiced grin plastered on his face. "One more for the road, Deanie?" A called out, his voice thick with a forced joviality. Dean offered no reply, only a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He settled onto the bench, the worn velvet cool against his worn trousers. His fingers, trembling slightly, found the ivory keys. Then, a melody, delicate and haunting, filled the hushed auditorium. It wasn't one of their standards, not a popular tune, but something intimately familiar to Frank. It was the song Dino Jr. had composed for Frank's 50th birthday, a playful, heartfelt tribute. Frank's smile faltered, then vanished. His eyes, usually so sharp, clouded with dawning recognition. The notes, each one a whisper from a cherished past, hit him like a physical blow. The easy banter died in his throat. He saw the subtle curve of Dean's lips, not a smile of triumph, but one of devastating sorrow. The memory, a forgotten shard of a long-ago conversation, resurface. "I bet you $1 million I can make you cry in front of D 000 people, and you won't even be mad at me." The music swelled, carrying with it the unbearable weight of shared history and recent unbearable loss. Frank's shoulders began to shake. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, then another, until his face was a crumpled mask of grief, utterly exposed under the harsh stage lights. The crowd, sensing the raw emotion, fell silent. Dean played on, the melody a cruel, beautiful eulogy. Years of laughter and song, the familiar scent of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne hung heavy in the air, a comforting blanket Dean had inhaled for decades. He ambled toward the grand piano, a rogue spotlight catching the silver in his hair. A hush fell over the packed ballroom, the clinking of glasses ceasing. Frank, ever the showman, leaned against the microphone, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's this, Dino?" he drawled, his voice a smooth bourbon. "A little solo act?" Dean settled onto the bench, his fingers hovering over the keys. The crowd murmured. The crowd murmured. The crowd murmured, sensing a shift in the usual banter. He didn't answer Frank, his gaze fixed on some distant memory. Then, a slow, melancholic melody drifted through the room. It was the opening to My Way, but not the version anyone knew. This was softer, infused with a raw vulnerability that twisted Dean's features. Frank's face, usually so composed, began to fracture. Recognition, sharp and agonizing, dawned in his eyes. This wasn't his version. This was the one Dino Jr. had painstakingly arranged a birthday surprise for Frank's 50th. The chords, so simple yet profound, had always been a private joke between the three of them. Now, each note was a hammer blow, striking at the fortified walls Frank had built around his grief. His chin began to tremble, then his shoulders. Tears welled, then spilled, tracing rivulets down his weathered cheeks. 10,000 people watched, mesmerized by the public unraveling of a legend. Dean played on, his own eyes burning, not with triumph, but with a shared, unspeakable pain. He had won, but the victory tasted like ash. The shadow of loss. The spotlight caught dust motes dancing in the stale air as Dean ambled to the grand piano. A hush fell over the packed theatre. The anticipatory hum of a New Year's Eve crowd suddenly silenced. Frank, a smile plastered on his face, raised a glass. "To 26 years, pal, and to many more." Dean settled onto the bench, a ghost of his usual swagger. His fingers, gnarled with age, hovered over the keys. Then he began to play. The melody, sweet and melancholic, was instantly recognizable to Frank. His smile faltered. It was Sunrise Serenade, the song Dino Jr. had written for his 50th birthday, a forgotten gift from a son lost too soon. Frank's face, usually so impassive, began to crumble. A tremor ran through his hand, spilling champagne onto the pristine white tablecloth. The crowd, sensing a shift in the air, leaned forward, murmuring. The lyrics, unspoken but vividly present in Frank's mind, echoed the boy's optimism, his burgeoning talent. A single tear tracked a path through the makeup on Frank's cheek, then another, until his face was a mask of raw grief. He understood now. This wasn't a performance, it was an elegy. When the final chord faded, Frank was openly weeping, unashamed before 10,000 people. Dean rose, his eyes hollow. "Keep your money, Frank," he rasped, his voice raw with unspoken pain. "I just needed you to feel what I feel." The roar of the crowd, a mix of confusion and pity, was a distant echo. The bet was won, but the price was everything. A different look in his eyes. The air backstage, thick with the ghosts of forgotten vices, offered a final, pungent benediction to long, winding careers. His reflection in the smudged mirror, betraying a face etched by countless spotlights, yet eyes that still held a spark. A dry, rasping laugh escaped him as Dean sauntered by, making for the wings. "Mind your entrance, pal. Wouldn't want to botch our grand finale." Dean's response was a fleeting, attenuated smile, a whisper of his customary swagger. "Never crossed my mind, Frank." But in his gaze resided a profoundness Frank hadn't witnessed in decades, not since, well, since memory's ledger blurred. A quiet resolve, mingled with a subtle wistfulness, subtly eroding Frank's usual, unflappable poise. It was a look that promised far, more than just another familiar standard. As the theatre lights softened, Dean settled onto the piano bench, the grand instrument gleaming under a solitary beam. In lieu of the expected upbeat flourish, an unfamiliar, delicate melody began to unfurl into the hushed anticipation. A prickle of unease traced Frank's spine. The notes, slow and imbued with sorrow, gradually coalesced, forming a tune Frank instantly recognized, a song he hadn't heard in years. His breath caught as understanding bloomed, a suffocating weight in his chest. This wasn't merely music. It was an unearthed memory, vivid and searing. Dean's fingers glided, evoking not just sound, but a lifetime of shared mirth and unspoken grief. Frank's carefully constructed facade began to splinter, a faint trembling betraying his lip. Tonight, this was the night, the melody of memory. The spotlight, a searing cyclops eye, caught Dean as he ambled towards the grand piano. A murmur rippled through the packed auditorium, a collective gasp of confusion. Dean, at the piano, that wasn't in the script. Frank, poised to deliver his usual witty repartee. With the slow-burning bewilderment clouding his features. Dean's fingers, gnarled with age and etched with countless melodies, hovered over the ivory keys, then descended. The first notes were hesitant, then bloomed into a familiar, tender melody. Frank's smile, a practiced mask of geniality, fractured. The tune was distinct, infused with a youthful exuberance only one person could have penned. Dino Jr.'s birthday song. The one he'd composed for Frank's 50th, a clumsy but heartfelt tribute. A single tear, a diamond caught in the stage lights, tracked a path down Frank's cheek. The crowd, sensing a shift in the evening's jovial atmosphere, quieted, their collective breath held captive. Frank swallowed hard, the taste of ash in his mouth. 26 years, the forgotten wager, resurrected by the cruelest of instruments. Dean hadn't forgotten. He was collecting. Dean continued to play, his eyes, shadowed and weary, fixed on Frank. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a profound, aching sorrow. Frank's knees buckled. The raw grief for Dean Jr., and now for Dean, a wave that threatened to drown him. He slumped against the microphone stand, openly weeping, the sound echoing through the hushed hall. Dean played the final, lingering chord, a perfect, devastating diminuendo. He had won and lost everything. A single beam of light impaled Dean at the grand piano, carving his silhouette from the swirling smoke. A collective gasp, then absolute silence, descended upon the packed ballroom. His fingers, knobby with age and sorrow, descended onto the keys. The initial notes weren't the anticipated swing or a celebratory New Year's anthem. Instead, a fragile, mournful melody unfurled, a tune Frank hadn't heard in decades, a forgotten whisper from a brighter past. Frank's customary grin evaporated, his eyes widening in dawning horror. It was that song, the one Dino Jr. had composed for his father's 50th, a simple, heartfelt tribute. Dean's voice, a gravelly murmur, began the lyrics, each word a slow, deliberate stab. Frank felt the treachery like a physical blow. The old wager, buried beneath years of camaraderie and shared laughter, clawed its way to the forefront of his memory, sharp and unforgiving. He glimpsed Dean's face, etched with a raw agony he now recognized as his own. The stage lights blurred into an indistinct halo. A ragged, involuntary sob tore from Frank's chest, tears, scorching and heavy, carved paths down his face, a public confession of his fractured spirit. Dean, his gaze unwavering, continued his morbid performance, collecting his grim prize. When the final, lingering chord dissolved, the ensuing silence throbbed. Frank stood, trembling the song's echo a fresh, bleeding wound. He found Dean backstage moments later, $1 million already transferred to a phantom account. "Take it," Frank rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. Dean simply shook his head, a faint, fleeting smile touching his lips. "Keep your money, Frank," he murmured, his eyes distant, unfocused. "I merely needed you to understand how I feel." He turned and walked away, abandoning Frank to the devastating truth of a friendship's cruelest, most definitive end, a public display of grief. The spotlight clung to Dean as he ambled towards the grand piano, a relic against the shimmering backdrop of the Vegas stage. A hush fell over the packed auditorium, replacing the boisterous anticipation with a subtle current of confusion. This wasn't in the set list. His fingers, gnarled with age but still graceful, found the keys. The first notes, a melancholic, familiar melody, drifted through the air. Frank, halfway through a joke about a priest and a rabbi, froze. The smile melted from his face, replaced by a dawning horror. It was Dino Jr.'s song, the one he'd penned for Frank's 50th, a clumsy but heartfelt ode to friendship and shared history. Dean's voice, a little huskier now, laced with an unbearable sorrow, began to sing the forgotten lyrics. Each word was a shard of glass, cutting through the decades. Frank's eyes, usually so sharp and knowing, glazed over. His shoulders began to tremble, a silent earthquake rippling through his tailored suit. He stumbled back, finding purchase on a nearby stool, and buried his face in his hands. 10,000 people watched Frank Sinatra, the untouchable icon, openly weep. The bet, the $1 million, Dean's voice, a ghostly echo of youth, continued its mournful serenade. Dean hadn't just collected, he'd laid bare a wound, raw and bleeding, for the world to see. He had weaponized memory, turning a cherished song into an instrument of exquisite agony. Frank looked up, his face a mask of crumpled grief and dawning comprehension. This wasn't just a performance. It was Dean's final, devastating goodbye, the unclaimed prize. The air thick with the ghosts of stale cigars and cheap cologne, usually a familiar embrace, now choked Frank like a funeral shroud. Dean's fingers, knotted with years and grief, found the piano keys. A tentative ripple of sound, then a bolder swell, cut the audience's hushed anticipation. Frank, mouth poised for a cutting remark, froze. This wasn't the usual showstopper, no brassy fanfare. The melody, tender and laced with a father's unique sorrow, seeped into the hall. Recognition, an icy shard, pierced Frank's composure. His breath snagged. This was the one. The song Dino Jr. had fumbled together for his 50th, a raw, heartfelt tribute to their bond. Dean hadn't touched it since before. Frank's usually sharp gaze blurred. The stage lights, blinding moments before, now formed a hazy halo around Dean's bowed figure at the piano. Each note struck Frank like a physical blow, dismantling the carefully constructed fortress of indifference he'd maintained for decades. The bet, that impossible, long-buried wager suddenly materialized, a cruel phantom whispering in his ear. Unstoppable tears, hot as spilled liquor, tracked paths down Frank's face. He tried to speak, to halt the inevitable, but only a ragged sob escaped. The microphone, forgotten and trembling in his grip, amplified the sound through the vast auditorium. 10,000 faces. Just moments ago a sea of adoring fans became a worried blur. Dean slowly lifted his head, his rheumy, distant eyes finding Frank's. A faint, almost imperceptible nod. He had won, his prize claimed, but the victory resonated like a hollow echo in the vast, shared emptiness that now consumed them both.